Oh, I see them along the side, so I guess that's the same thing.
Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is a continuation of the South Asia Institute's series of master classes, which have focused on Columbia faculty with specializations in South Asia. And the initial impetus which began last fall, was to give people an opportunity, especially students who weren't able to come to campus, to actually see the faculty and meet them virtually without, since we didn't have the usual convention of being able to stop by office hours or catching somebody after a colloquium or something like that. This seemed to be a way for people to actually build a bit of community, nothing like the real thing. And now we have some opportunity to come back together, but still we want to continue this series. And today I'm delighted to be able to welcome Vishakha Desai. I will tell you just a touch about her because she'll be spending some time telling us about herself. But I would just begin by saying that I see her as an important example of a career that is deeply rooted in scholarship and academia, but has also, her career has also expanded well beyond the ivory tower. She has been, and I'll just give one little tidbit of how that expansion has been recognized. She was described by Crane's New York business as one of the most powerful women in New York City. And I don't think there are too many people within the ivory towers of Columbia who could be described in those terms. Dr. Desai is a senior advisor for global affairs to the president of Columbia University. So you can see one spot where she reaches to the top levels of the university and beyond. She's chair of the Committee on Global Thought and senior research scholar in global studies at the School of International and Public Affairs. She has also served as the president and CEO of the Asia Society, a global organization dedicated to strengthening partnerships amongst peoples of Asia and the United States. And she did that from 2004 to 2012. And then before joining the Asia Society, she was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston as curator for Indian and Southeast Asian art, and the head of public programs and academic affairs. She's also taught at Columbia and Boston University and in a tenured position at the University of Massachusetts. She has a number of publications, a book in 2008 on Asian art history in the 21st century, numerous exhibition catalogs for Asian and especially South Asian art, and many op-ed pieces and scholarly articles. So we can see this kind of somebody who's really at the intersection of scholarship and the world in ways that I think many of us envy, and many students coming into the academic world with this sort of troubled state of the university today would see as a model to be emulated. She has a recently published book that I know some of you have read, or a number of you, World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings, published this year. So with that, please join me in thought, even if you can't raise your hands for us to see, in welcoming Dr. Vishakha Desai.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. And good morning, everyone, and greetings from our Zoom boxes. I wish I could see you in person, but since we can't do that, I do hope that those of you who are on campus, just sign up sometimes and come and see me because I'm across from Knox Hall, right in the Riverside Church in the MLK building. So I'm delighted that you've all joined us. And I really will say that many of you are right now without your video. But at some point, I want to see your faces. And I want to engage in a discussion with you. So it'll be about as close to a conversation as we can get. So don't worry about where you are, but I'd love to see you if I can. And what I'm going to do, and as per my conversation with Kathy and with Gwen, is that I'm going to talk for just a little bit about, since the purpose of the masterclass is for you to get to know us as people, not just as scholars, that I'm going to really try to take some time to just say, how do I think about why am I the way I am and how do I get there? What are the ways that really go into making of my work professionally? And I actually do feel that I feel very blessed that my feeling is that for me, the professional and personal have come together in a way that I could have never imagined. And because of this book, The World as Family, which is more like a memoir, I realized that how much of it was really part of my trajectory that actually unfolded, even if I wasn't conscious of it. But there was a pattern to this madness. When Kathy describes all the various things I've done, it might sound like I'm a completely schizophrenic person, that I have more like a dancing Shiva, multiple arms going out into the different world. But exactly like the Natraj, I actually do have a core. And that core is what I've tried to figure out. What is it? And it does have to do with, as a dancer, I would say that core comes right in my belly button. It's at the center of who I am. And that is starting from my family. And it does have to do with adding layers of experiences that actually unfolded, but some basic stuff that actually came from how I grew up. And so I'm going to just kind of give you a sense of what are those unfolding patterns. And those of you who have read different sections, you will see it. Those of you who have not, I hope that it gives you some sense. And we're going to try to figure out that you all who don't have the book, if you can get a discount, we're going to try to figure this out. So stay tuned on that as well. So I think about that stupid little book that actually came out a long time ago that says that everything I learned in a kindergarten. I almost think that everything I learned or who I am began with the family. And it was about how I grew up. Born right after independence and born into the family of freedom fighters, I feel very privileged to have parents, both of whom were active freedom fighters. My father being pretty much a leader in Gujarat, especially for young people. And he was also a journalist and a writer. So, one of the things I learned growing up is that it was a home that had both lots of different people coming in who went all the way from freedom fighters who had worked with my father to women who my mother was involved with as one of the co-founders of the first women's institutions in India. And then, because he was a writer, but he was also just a voracious collector. And he believed that this was in the beginning of modernization, where lots of older pieces were being discarded, especially architectural pieces. And he would go to the Sunday markets, pick this up. And it was almost like discussing that if we want to build a new country, we better pay attention to what our past is. And therefore, there was that idea of nation building with objects at the center or at the very core of how to think about India, the modern nation that was an ancient civilization. So this was something that I didn't know about that much, but it was very much all around us, everywhere. And so, in a way, we imbibed that idea. That, along with going to a Gandhian school that had not an English medium school, but a Gujarati medium school, where learning about Gujarat, about India, about Sanskrit, about what made India what it was, and then at the same time using the famous saying by Gandhiji that said that I want to keep my house with the floor strong and let the windows and doors open, let the wind from the outside come in, but not let it shake the ground. And that idea was very fundamental to the way I grew up. And then this idea of intersection of nation building and art and culture, in a way, continued to really unfold as I came to America as a 17-year-old. Long time ago, more than 50 years ago now. And I have to tell you all that yesterday I had some work to do, and I actually got to go to the first home I arrived in with an American family where I lived in Sagaponack. And I actually walked in there with new owners, new people, and to relive that, to recognize how much that was seminal to my experience as a young 17-year-old who had never flown, who didn't know much about America because in those days you didn't, because there were no television. And yes, we knew that it was there through the news reports, but not visually. And the reality is that I then made that idea of intersection between culture and political my own without knowing that it was a conscious effort because I came to America at the height of Vietnam War. And during that time, being at Santa Barbara High School and being asked to speak about this war, one thing that really occurred to me as a 17-year-old is that you could be against the war, for the war, but we didn't know anything about that country. We didn't know anything about that culture. That Vietnam was equated with war. Not a place, not a country, not a culture. And to a 17-year-old naive mind of mine, I actually said, wait a minute, what if there was a war between India and the United States? And people would call it India War. They wouldn't call it and wouldn't realize that it was a 5,000-year-old civilization with millions of people living there, the cities that people would use as we use the names of, Dien Bien Phu and Ha Long Bay. We didn't know what that was and how it was necessary to ground your knowledge in the people, in the culture, before you make policy decisions about wars and where do we go. And guess what? Today, we now recognize the same mistake that was made with Afghanistan. We moved in, now we're out 20 years later, we still didn't know enough about that culture. If we had known that these are fiercely independent people, that they have their own culture, we might have done things differently, but we didn't take the time to learn. So that got me going to actually think about how are we going to learn about people who are different from us to make decisions about them and about us if we don't understand them as people, as culture, as societies. And that was kind of what got me going to say, okay, the way I can see this is to become a political science major when I went back to India and somehow get culture as part of this IR or the international relations kind of frame, because that's the only way I could think about how to do that. And actually, it didn't work out that way, partly because I met a ton of people in Mumbai through my father who were all ambassadors and people who were representing their country. And almost all of them, I thought, could never say what was going on in Vietnam. And I had lived this, right? So one of the ways that I thought about was, I don't know if political science is the way to go, even though I had majored in it. And this was in Bombay University at Elphinstone College, at that point considered a very powerful intellectual place, one of the best, so forth and so on. What was shocking to me is that it was as if Brits had never left, and that everything we studied in political science was all European, basically, from Machiavelli to John Stuart Mill. And I was very interested in Mao and Gandhi. And I asked the professor to say, can we study those things or have something? She said, well, that's not one of your papers. There's no way. So if you want to do it. So I actually tried to read those things through my father and the books that he was getting. The point I'm making is that sometimes the academic work you do may not completely relate to where you want to go, but you do need to have the disciplinary knowledge to figure out as to what's going to happen next. So the next step was completely serendipitous. And that was that I fall in love with a Peace Corps worker, come back to the United States, and I'm at the in Cleveland, because that's where he was. And he had not yet finished his undergraduate work, so because he was trying to avoid the draft for Vietnam. So that was always around Vietnam, right? And ultimately, because of my training in Bharatanatyam, the dean of the School of the Arts and Arts and Sciences learned about that and said, gee, why don't you perform? And I said, well, let's not just do a straight performance, because I'd been in Santa Barbara High, I'd performed there, and I knew that people didn't know anything about classical Indian dance, unlike where we are today, where New York Times actually covers it in main section. It was just not so then. And I decided to do something with dance and sculpture, and what did it mean? And long story short, the head of education department at Cleveland was there and offered me a job. And I started working in the museum, first really as a dancer, but also as somebody who was interested in the arts. And as I talked to him, he said, you're a good teacher, just come and work with us and you'll figure out how to learn about the collections. When I tell people that today, they say, okay, yeah, I know it doesn't work like that. I know it doesn't work like that. But this was long before the days of multiculturalism. And the amazing thing is that this head of education, whose PhD was in aesthetics, he actually believed that the museums that represent different cultures, and Cleveland was one of the best museums in the country and one of the finest collections of Asian art. And he said, I want to make sure that people from those cultures can actually talk about these collections. And it's not just the people who have training, but people who also have personal relationships. And so that's how I got the job. And my first job was to work with fifth graders from one of the poorest sections of Cleveland, African American kids who, and the very unusual program where they were there for 6 weeks at a time, and they came for a whole day to be at the museum, and we did all kinds of programs. What was amazing to me is that from the first day, when they didn't even know where India was and who I was, because when I said I was Indian, they immediately said it was Hopi or Navajo or one of the Native American tribes. And when I said, no, 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 I'm the real Indian, they said, what do you mean real Indian? Because to them, the real Indian was what they had heard about. And from there, 6 weeks later, that Chola Nataraja and the Cleveland Museum of Art was actually their friend. They were roaming those galleries like it was theirs. And we invited their parents later, and the kids were taking the parents through the collection. So to a 21-year-old like myself, I just felt that that was the power of art. Power of art to connect. And if I essentially believed in this notion of connectivity among people, art was a pretty good way to start. Now, never mind that, of course, at that point, I was not as aware as we all are now that art has the capacity to connect across cultures. Art is also a product of a specific time and a specific place. And that means that there are all kinds of issues of power, movement of art, repatriation, nationalism, all of the questions that come up today. Actually, we were not as focused on because the focus was on the transcendent power of art. So today, what we recognize with museums is that we're coming back to recognize that art is about both, and you have to find some kind of a way to deal with both. Perhaps we're going too far into the nationalism, ownership, possession, power, those ideas. Who owns art? Who has the right to own art? But art itself refuses to be in a box. Art is about both of those things. And how do we deal with that is also partly a perfect metaphor. And that brings me to the next question, and that is that I have always thought of art both about asking new questions and about raising ways of thinking about art that perhaps one has not thought about. And that has allowed me to always think about the political, social context on one hand, but also lives of art, as Barney Cohen has written about, lives of objects, very long history of objects that can change meaning. And that interests me. So the exhibitions that I did while I was primarily a curator and the head of academic programs was to try to look at new questions of old material and then beginning to open up other questions that were not being asked. So the first exhibition, major exhibition that I did called Life at Court during Festival of India was to look at essentially non-religious, non-literary art from both the Mughal and Rajput courts, because at that point in the field of Indian painting, there was still this feeling that Mughal art is courtly art, Rajput art is religious art, which is a Hindu courts in both northwestern India, in Rajasthan and Punjab hills. And I was really interested in, and also it was the thought the 17th century was the best kind of Rajput art. By 18th century, it was becoming decadent. So I said, okay, let's look at this. And so this idea of courtly pictures was to look at where the intersections were occurring between the Rajput and Mughal courts and what did it look like. That gives you a sense of, I'm always looking at, the word intersectionality didn't exist then, but I am really always interested in these in-between spaces. I think that's kind of like somebody might say my middle name is in-betweenness. And that's true of many of us who are between cultures or connect to many cultures. The next big exhibition that then I was working on was, it was about North Indian sculptures. And if you look at that catalog, you will see that what I was interested in is not only that these objects that were in museum collections, both Indian and Western collections, are really fragments of much bigger cosmological significance, temples. And in the art historical field, again, it was thought that good Indian sculptures was up to Gupta period, 5th century, 6th century. 10th century, medieval sculpture, so-called, was just not so good. And the reason why people thought that is that these fragments that were placed in different parts of the temple, they were not meant to be seen as these individual objects. And of course they felt distorted. Of course they felt like they didn't belong, because they didn't belong. And so I was particularly interested in the question of why around the 8th and 9th century there is proliferation of temple building. What is going on, especially in the northern part of India. So by that I mean Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, as well as Gujarat, and in that arena, not the below the Gangetic Belt, not southern India. And these are stone sculptures. And I asked a historian, who's a political historian of medieval India, to actually write to say what is going on. And it was something that art historians had never really asked the question, and that was that temples were being built because actually the new kingdoms were coming into line, and temples were a way to mark political boundaries and spaces in which they were active. So that was a direct relationship between political patronage and temple building, hence the proliferation of temples. The other question I was interested in is the function of temples. And so Phyllis Granoff, who has been at Yale, a giant scholar, but she's done a tremendous amount of work on functions of temples. And she used some of the early manuscripts to talk about temples that were also used for lovers to hide, for thieves to come in and take protection, kinds of very plebeian functions that actually in the literature, we only talked about the spiritual dimension of temple rather than the political and social functions of temple. So these were the kinds of questions that interested me. And ultimately from there, when I come to the Asia Society, by that time, 1990, I was very besotted with the question of why is it that we don't look at 20th century art from Asia? Why we didn't study it? Because we were all told that by the time the British arrive and what happens, things are in decline and actually there's nothing interesting to look at. And then the new art that's being hoisted on Indians is the Western art, and that's just too parochial and too simple and provincial and not worth looking at. And it was really reading anthropologists like Clifford Geertz and other people that I began to realize that how much we were part and parcel of the product of what the colonial powers that be had established as what was good art was ancient art. By the time they come to power, things are in decline and they are the savior of culture. And therefore, this too was part of a political dimension of how the discipline was created. This was not something that art historians were talking about. So it helped me to say, wait a minute, this issue of not looking at living arts of Asia, especially India, was directly related to certain political formulations of disciplines. And we need to change that. And so I am very pleased that when I came to the Asia Society, because I wasn't initially interested in the job, and they talked to me, and I said, well, you might think that I have all the right credentials because I have all the right degree and I've done the right kind of exhibitions in the pre-modern art. I really want to do this, contemporary art. And they said, what? How are you going to do that? And I said, well, clearly we have to figure that out. But unless you're interested, I'm not your person. So, don't hire me. Well, much to my surprise, they actually decided they wanted to do that. And long story short, using contemporary art, I think, also opened up the messiness of Asianness in America that we had to deal with. And for me, it brought back the idea of the intersection of the political, social, and aesthetic production within, because that's what the artists were doing. That's where the artists were. So they gave voice to the inchoate feelings that I had. And it really changed the trajectory of how contemporary Asian art was viewed in this country, in the US. And it made me realize that I too no longer was just going to be an informant, as it were, of India of the long past, Asia of another world, to Asia now, India now. And I was both a participant and an activist trying to give voice to that area. And that led me to the next part of my life, which is from being a director of the museum, doing all this work. I was chosen to be the president of Asian Society in 2004. And there are lots of questions about multicultural identities that you can read in the book. I won't get into that right now. But what was interesting is that Asia Society, for those of you who don't know, is as much about art and culture as it's about policy and education. And it allowed me to really bring my interest in the political realm and the cultural realm in a way that most art museums were not doing at the time, and even now are not completely, because that's not what they do. And so it became a perfect place for me to try these things out. And that allowed me to start new programs, especially with young people, that brought together artists, activists, policymakers, all young, under the age of 30, to come together from different parts of Asia as well as the United States. And through them, I really began to realize that there was something going on with the younger generation, like all of you, is that you actually think about the world differently. And that has a lot to do with communication, the pace of communication, the ability and the accessibility of the world, partly as we began to develop World Wide Web and internet and all of that. So it's that sort of the internet of the world right in your palm. And that made me realize that there was something going on, and especially with the younger generation now, the Generation Z, sort of kids like you or people like you who are in this particular arena. And that is that you're living in the local, global, national world simultaneously. But there is something about that simultaneity that also causes some anxiety, what I call the anxiety of simultaneity. And therefore, I was trying to figure out, how did I get to do this, to be aware of my place in the world without having to give up my Indianness or my Americanness, and creating this new space. And that led me to write the book the way I did, which is, how did I become so passionate about my sense of global belonging without having to give up my local, national, transnational sense of moving. And I feel very, very fortunate that actually in every position that I've had, or the professional career I've had, I've been able to add and continue to learn new things. And so I'm, in that sense, a very good Iranian friend of mine said, you realize that how Indian it is that you always add layers without dropping anything off. That Indic tradition seems to be that there is fewer contradictions and more living with things that seem apparently contradictory. I don't know if that's true, but there's probably something to that. Um, if those of you are interested, will probably remember that there's some things written by various scholars, and I particularly think of the Ramanujan, who did a very important essay called An Indian Way of Thinking. And partly he was sort of talking about perhaps there is an Indian way, but there is something about this multiplicity and synthetic way of being that seems to be part of the Indic tradition. Never mind that those ideas of syncretic, synthetic, multiple ways of thinking of yourself are under huge attack right now. And the emphasis on particular way of being and narrowing it down seems to be what is much more important for some people and the leaders in India today than how Indic tradition could be defined. So the reason I wrote the book was partly to kind of say, gee, how did I think about this layering? And also, is this a particularly late 20th and early 21st century phenomenon, which is that this is not a story of an immigrant of from and to, coming from India and becoming American. In fact, the more stories are about and. How do you actually create and embody multiple identities within yourself and use that as a way to be more capacious about being in the world? And so I define in that sense cosmopolitanism as not something that's out there abstracted in the world, but it's actually rooted and at the same time recognize that this is not a walk in the park. It's confusing at times, it's messy at times, and wires get crossed within yourself. And I write about that because I think it's important to recognize that actually this requires work. But it's worth doing partly because if COVID has taught us anything, that is that we cannot think about ourselves as individuals' identity or independent identity without thinking about our interdependent self. So that idea of independence in relation to interdependence is what COVID reminds us again and again. That today we know we can't be safe until more people in the global south are also safe. We have to deal with this. So the idea of global as relational, contextual, and locally specific, in which, like Epalim says, you build things, is something that we need to create. And so the book ultimately brings all of this together. It's like peeling the onions and you come back to some basics, but without giving up that core is really what it's about. And with that, I will stop and I'm going to try to get this sun out of my eyes and let's hear from all of you. Just terrific. That's better. So Quinn, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I'll jump in here and say thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing this with us and kind of like setting the stage. I will repeat, was something that you said to the rest of the participants. If you don't own a copy, let me know. We can see if we can find a discount. It is a delight to read. If you haven't, it's a unique book in the sense that it is so readable. It is such a delight. And we were really in the class, we're going through the prose of it, saying this is what good writing looks like, but without sacrificing a certain kind of focus. So if you don't have the book already, do not deny yourself the pleasure any longer. So I thought I would just and now sort of transition and encourage people, turn on your cameras if you like, it's a little more familiar. If you can't for some reason, I know we have a student who didn't want to miss this, but she's on a train right now. Even if you can't, don't feel like you can't ask questions, even with your camera off. But I just want to get things kind of warmed up and ask you, what have been some of the reactions to the material, to the book, from the younger people that you talk to, from students? And the reason I ask is because we had this moment in class yesterday when we were discussing your book. We were kind of talking about, when I was an undergrad, my program was obsessed with globalization. They say there's two schools of thought. When did globalization start? Something like 1974 or 200,000 BCE. And so in the book, you tell this story about there's something going on now. There's something's happening in the world. Something about technology, it's unclear. I wonder if some of the reactions to the students have had to the book can kind of get us to maybe start to put our finger on what is it about right now as opposed to something 1,500 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that In fact, that's a question that came up even before I had finished the book, because since I teach in the Global Thought program as well as in CEPA from time to time, that one of the things that students were asking, especially in the Committee on Global Thought, and I see that one of my students is actually in your class as well, and one thing that came up in the last few years that students would ask is said, you know, I understand that I have to think about the world, but it's confusing because it's too much, and it's confusing to deal with this multiplicity. This is what I call the anxiety of multiplicity, and I and it seems like you don't have that anxiety. And how did you get there? And so one of the questions that I think that what is going on right now, and if anything, COVID also exposes this in a big way, is that it's both about the world, the local tradition, and the national, and people are moving. So it may be, I mean, it is true that some people have talked about, like Nayan Chanda, where it says bound together, and he says we've always bound together, starting from the DNA that comes from Africa and elsewhere. And yet, the pace and the dimensions by which things come together or not, or is people. Today, we have 300 million people who live in the place they were not born in. Unprecedented number. That's more than or almost the same as the whole population of the United States. With climate crisis, you're going to have more people on the move because there are more climate refugees than ever. So the one thing is the pace of movement, both in terms of travel by choice, but also by force, is huge. The second one is the technology. And lots of people have written about it, Arjun Appadurai being the preeminent anthropologist who has done this work. And that is that there are both processes of interconnectivity and forms of interconnectivity that are going back and forth. And to therefore unpack that and to live in that space is confusing, but also complex. So it does seem to me that this moment and where we live, between communication, movement of people, and let's face it, crises that we face, whether it is climate or COVID, these crises don't know national borders. We know that. And therefore, we are aware, and young people, studies after studies show that Generation Z is much more aware of these crises that are at the global level, and they feel overwhelmed. And at the same time, they're also butting up against the inability and dysfunctionality of systems. That actually, any international systems we have, all built basically post-World War II, the Bretton Woods Institution and what you have you, or one might even say the kind of enlightenment in a Cartesian sense idea that has been the predominant way that the world has behaved, privileging of the rational thinking, privileging of the individual. What it has meant is that we are not creating knowledge systems that are much more relational. We, in the 19th century, created these disciplines. Disciplines are important. We need that specific knowledge. But now is the time to go from that specificity that we need to more synthetic way of connecting, because that's where the problems are and how we need to think about it. So I think all of that says that this is a different moment than, and moment is not the right word, but I mean the period that we live in. And we don't have enough narratives, I would say, to actually say, how do we live in this multiplicity of being? And I think we need more. And if you notice, I don't use the word globalization too much, because globalization immediately has been hijacked by the economic and the political side. And that globalization as a word is attacked both by the right and the left, the progressives and everybody else, because it feels extractive and it has this image of the Davos man, Goldman Sachs and McDonald's, and before that, that somehow it's not rooted, it doesn't have any connectivity to a place. And so I think we need more way of visualizing how to live in this reality. And at the same time, recognize that it's tough to do this. And yet, one thing that I feel like the pace of change is faster than social and cultural attitudes that human beings develop. It takes much longer time to change. Um, and yet we don't really focus on that. So in the global discussions, there's very little about people. There's very little about individual experiences. And I think we need that as we go forward. So that, it seems to me, is where more energy needs to be brought in, especially from the sort of humanistic side of disciplines, and trying to, I mean, people are writing lots about the liminality of experiences, but through that liminality, how do we get to this notion of the world as family? And one argument I make is that the reality is that we know that functional families, we learn how to be yourself, but in relation to the unit. The unit of analysis is the family, right? And it wasn't until COVID that this idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that overused, jargony kind of phrase in the South Asian tradition, in the Indic tradition, that how brilliant that was. Because it focused on the unit of analysis as family and apply that to the world. And we would say our global family is pretty dysfunctional. And when families are dysfunctional, they're destructive. We know that. And that's where we are. So we got to get on with creating the global family more functional. And so there you are.
Well, I appreciated that with with the book. You talked about we need more individual voices. We need to know what this really looks like, for an individual. And you really kind of show, don't tell, right? Like you demonstrate that through the prose of the book, through the story you tell. I'll take a breath here and stifle all of the questions I have and see if I'm opening up to the rest
So
of our audience.
let's have questions from some of you who are there. And it could be anything. If you read, not read, any questions that come up as I talk. Don't be shy. All right, some people are muted.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Lily. We met earlier last summer. I'm Dale Mason's intern. I don't know if you remember, but I was wondering what you think about the state of South Asian art now, and if you've been to any recent exhibitions, and what you think, how you would place it in South Asia, the representation of South Asia today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I will say that, it's scary to think about the fact that we started doing the work in the 90s. So you're already, it's like a quarter century. And at the same time, I would say that it's beginning to be now mainstreamed a little bit more. But I will say that from my perspective, it is getting recognized in exhibitions in a mainstream museum. So you can have Nasreen's show at the Met, or you will have some South Asian Americans in other exhibitions, a wonderful show of Shazia at the Morgan Library, another example. But what we need is more sustained scholarship in modern and contemporary South Asian art. Right now, it's now gone too much towards a collectibility of the art. And lots of people are buying things, especially the South Asian communities, buying things that are from modern masters in the second half of the 20th century. But we still need more systemic scholarly work done from almost the 18th, late 18th and 19th century into the 20th century to the 21st century. So that thread and the scholarly work still needs to be done. Because lots of people have jumped into contemporary, but in fact, we don't have full understanding of that thread that's going on. And the other thing is that in South Asian tradition, and by that I mean India, Pakistan, I think that more people could benefit from more interactivity, and that usually happens more outside of South Asia because the difficulties of connecting. And I'm very happy to say that the India Center of the Asia Society is moving in the direction of creating a more South Asian presence. And they recognize that while you might not be able to meet in India or in Pakistan, it'll be easier to meet in Sri Lanka or in Nepal or something like that. So they are beginning to develop that. But there's a lot more work to be done, that's for sure. The only last thing I will say is that at the same time, now I'm really worried about pre-modern art history because I'm told, I don't know if that's true or not, but that close to 77% of all art history majors in South Asia now want to do contemporary. And that means as if the last 5,000 years don't matter. And so I'm worried about that. Even though having started this thing about making a case for modern and contemporary, now I'm very worried that if we don't study the past, we will be in trouble again. And so somehow the mixture has to be a little different. Thank you, Lily. I do
Thank
remember
you.
seeing you because you came through Dale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Yes.
remember that. All right.
I have a question. My name is Siona. I'm in Quinn's class as well. In reading your book, I noticed in a few places where you mentioned the dissonance between what you felt about yourself and how you were perceived by people, because that ethnicity is obviously very visible. And I was wondering if at any point you found that that dissonance reduces or that there was more fluidity between your identities, and how or if you feel any sense of responsibility given that our ethnicity is so visible and now more recognized in places like New York and other cosmopolitan areas, where you feel any responsibility to sort of represent or correctly represent one side of your identity or the other, or both, maybe.
Yeah, boy, that's a very important and a big question, right? What does it mean to represent a community is a big question. And I write about it in the book, as you recall, that when I was identified and selected as the president of the Asia Society, that immediately there was this pressure that somehow I was to represent. For Indians, it felt like, okay, what are you going to do for India? And then Asian Americans were like, okay, what are you going to do for Asian Americans? And the same questions then came, the flip side was Chinese who were saying, okay, who are you? Are you going to be really about just India? Or are you really an American? And so you can't win either way, right? And so one thing that I realized is that I just was going to navigate that all the time. And I was not going to let other people define me, even though they perceive me a particular way. The other part that becomes quite important for women, and that was the marker of your identity. So, what do I wear when I'm going to meetings? And I can tell you, I had 3 different jackets in my office. If I was going to meet some corporate people, I had one kind of dress. If I was going to meet a particular foreign dignitary, I had another kind of dress. And jackets were useful because then it could be Chinesey, it could be Indian, it could be something else, something in between. But I refuse to only wear that, so that for all big events, mainly black tie events, I almost invariably wore a sari. Why? A, because it's cheaper for me than to have to buy constantly new black tie dresses. Like, forget it, I'm not doing that. B, because I love the fabric. And I was going to let other people decide what I was going to wear. So, what the hell if they thought it was too Indian? I don't care. But there were times when I had to be careful. And so, this is something when I talk to my male colleagues, they just don't have to worry. So, if you think about Indra Nui, she almost never wore Indian clothes, except when she was in India. Because in the corporate world, that was really the only way she could handle it. And so I'm looking forward to reading her book to see whether she says something about that. Um, and so I think one thing about this business of representation is that this question is particularly important for people of color in this country. Nobody, as I mentioned in the book, my husband was the president of the Asian Society. He was white, Yale PhD, and very Anglo. Well, nobody ever asked him, are you going to represent all the Anglo people? So why should I have to represent everybody and anybody? At the same time, to be aware that you do have that weight is important. And so you recall in the book, I talk about my discussion with Richard Holbrooke, a major diplomat, was the chair of the board. And when he introduced me to the press and said, well, we chose Vishakha because, not because she's a woman, not because she's Indian, not because she's Asian American, but because it's all neutral, gender neutral, race neutral, blah, 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 and that because she was the best candidate. And then I had to tell him later on, I said, don't say that in public. Because you know what? Because I'm a woman, because I'm of Indian origin, and I consider myself an Asian American, and I come from the cultural background, which they never had anybody from, I will be a different president. I will embody all of those attitudes. So I don't want people to think it's gender neutral. It is gender specific. It's okay. And that idea of gendered or racialized identity is something that we're now beginning to talk about in terms of even the critical race theory, which is that the systems, is it that you're going to fit into it or you're going to change the systems? I always say, I don't want just a seat at the table. I want to change the shape of the damn table. And that means it's only when you recognize and be aware that that can happen. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think that it's pretty complex and you just have to constantly be self-aware of the location, the specificity. So the last thing I would say is that, again, and this is not new to me. I've talked to lots of younger people who say, when somebody says, who are you or where are you from? What, the minute they say where you're from, it's a code. It's because they don't think you're from here. How many times have you asked this question or been asked that question? And one of my younger colleagues said once, I always say, well, it depends. Do you want a long answer or the short answer? Because she was born in Tanzania of Indian parents who grew up in America, and now her parents are divorced and one lives in India and one lives in Africa. And she said, so I don't know how to answer that question. And I think that I also often say it depends. I have at least 6 different identities. What do you want to know? And that could be anything from being an Indian American to Indian living in America to American of Indian origin to Asian American to being an Ahmedabadi girl who lives in New York to a New Yorker who happens to come from Ahmedabad. And each one of these are quite specific in the context in which you operate. And we behave differently in those different contexts. So it's both rich and sometimes totally messed up. But Yeah,
that's something there. I mean, I think what the point, that vignette about your qualifications for or your positioning in terms of the Asia Society job is important and can be linked to attitudes about scholarship itself. That the scholar is the objective scholar is in the old parlance is from
right,
nowhere, and therefore can be removed from the text and simply an objective account can be
right,
given. And I think there's an interesting analogy with,
right,
the best candidate is, unmarked and from nowhere.
right.
And
Exactly,
I think you're saying we're all from somewhere. And to
exactly,
not
exactly.
mark the white male, for example,
Right.
means that they take on that status of the objective administrator, the objective scholar. And I think that's a really important thing.
And it also therefore is seen as the paradigm
Right.
of what it's to be. And that's why you have to change the paradigm. Otherwise, the variation doesn't really occur
Yeah.
because everybody's to fit into somebody else's model, you know. I have I was involved in some other project in science, and this is an oceanographer in Sri Lanka who discovered blue whales in Sri Lanka on the Indian Ocean. And when she discovered that, and she was excited, and she's very connected to the group of scientists, and she said how shocking it was that when she talked to people, everybody got excited, and then the big male European and American oceanographers said, "Oh, well, we'll come and help you. Can you get me a permit? And then you can help me develop this." And she said, this notion that science is gender neutral, science is culture neutral, is also BS.
Mhm.
And that she is fighting very hard about the colonization of science. And so there is some of these issues that we often think it is completely neutral. Well, it isn't really, because it comes from some knowledge system, it comes from some paradigm that people have developed. Now, is that the only thing? No, but it does affect who we are.
And I think related to that, and maybe I'll take a little time to just kind of go back over a few other things you said, but not to prevent other people from jumping in, but there were a few things you were saying along the way of your life that um, you talked about a change in art history and the way I see a similar change, but I want to ask a lot more about it. Sort of from simply judging art as good or bad, which as an anthropologist has always kind of driven me nuts about
Right,
art history. From what stance and from what criteria, from
right,
what particular aesthetic are you
exactly,
judging art as good or bad?
right,
And I always found that mysterious. And then related to that, of course, is I did notice that you cited quite a few, well, at least a few anthropologists and the lens of anthropology,
right,
which as
right,
an anthropologist, I sort of like to see that maybe that discipline or that stance um, of anthropology has actually had a significant impact on
right,
the
right,
discipline of art history. And I
right,
guess I wonder if that's because of the sort of historically fundamental methods of anthropology, or to put it, I think in Clifford Geertz's terms, to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar.
right,
Sort of we denaturalize our view of ourselves and that sense of being an objective observer and really kind of get in the weeds and really
right,
experience life from another perspective.
yeah.
Um, and
Well,
so
I mean,
um,
that's a really interesting question because I think that one of the reasons why the tension exists, it seems to me, is that the discipline of art history had these two strands. The one strand was about the style and the form and the primacy of form to make a distinction between history and anthropology and art history. The study of form then became an obsession, which then was about which form is superior, because there's some aesthetic judgments that have to be made. And I think I come out somewhere in between, in that there are things I learned from anthropologists, which is what questions to ask. But how to still have the primacy of the form, so that the form is not just used as an illustration and product of a broad culture, that there is something about, and so the even in the Greek tradition, they understood that there's something about that aesthetic consideration that is about making, that goes beyond the doing and being a product of something. And how, so there's a dynamic tension between understanding the creative side of things and the product side of thing as a cultural production, and how to do both is what's challenging but also interesting. And so when I do an exhibition, for example, or have done exhibitions, I always feel that it's very important to also think about the visual impact of it. If you just write, if a picture or an object is just seen as an illustration in a book, then you'll do a book. What is the difference between that visual experience and something that is seen as a product of something much broader? Is part of the tension, and that makes it more dynamic in some ways. But I do feel that when people go too much in one way or too much in the other direction, then you lose the power of what art and the potential of art. So that's where I come out as a museum person. I don't want to give up that idea of the visuality of something, you know.
Yeah. And the reality is that, even as embedded within a cultural setting, one
Right.
does make judgments about how good certain things are or not.
Exactly, exactly. So when we did, for example, Gods, Guardians, and Lovers, the medieval sculpture show, and it was at the Age Society, um, and there was a big question that we should do a kind of a puja to suggest the idea of functionality of how these objects fitted into a temple. And we had created a little diagram and the inner sanctum and so forth and so on, and that could be used one object. And some of my education people said, it would really give people a sense of how objects come to life. And I had to say, no, you can't do that. Because if you make an inanimate object that is no longer in use, put it back in use, you can't then go back. I mean, these are essentially dead objects in a way. And that's important too, to understand which context. So you can show a film, you can do other things, but don't use the object itself, because it is not appropriate. Even if it's an inner sanctum object, a Shivalinga, it's better, because then you have a responsibility to keep it alive. And those kinds of things become very important as to what is your strategy for the education. Yeah. Gauri has just joined. Yeah. There was another question. Did I see a hand?
I have another one that is a little bit different, but someone has a question. I will.
Did I see Saurabh wanting to ask a question? Is that true? Just ask to unmute. There are 3 chats. Let's see. There you go. All right. So there is a discount code that's put in the chat. That's good. All right. If no question, then
Well,
go ahead, Kathy.
Just another thing you said along the way that I thought was really important, that maybe could be unpacked a little bit more as well. You were saying that we need more narratives about how we live today. And I think there's implicit in that is the role of and importance of narratives in creating lives.
Mhm.
That it's not simply that we live our lives in the world, and
Right.
your image of the family, for example, is an important sort of agenda for how we live in the world. That narratives create reality and create trajectories, and that's one of the reasons I think that this, I was thinking that this masterclass series would be an important one in this time of COVID,
Right.
because precisely to give the community a sense of narratives that we haven't necessarily had before. So anyway,
Right.
I'd like you to maybe say a little
No, I
more
mean,
about
I think that it was very interesting to me when, because it's Columbia University Press that published it, and there were two academic readers, and one of them just said that why this book was important was that there are so few personal narratives by South Asian women. There are lots of fictional things, right? But personal narratives by women describing what it would be like to be in the world. And that therefore that was important, partly because, I mean, I always think about Susan Sontag, who said that we tell stories to make sense of our lives and what it means to be human. And one of the things that I've thought about is that in this global space, there are almost no personal narratives. It's all about either abstracted global citizenship, global studies, global schlobal, if you will. But it doesn't ever relate to the personal. And global can be personal. And it's the personal that can then infuse the idea of global and globality with a way of being that I think is really, really needed. Because if it only stays at the theoretical, then people don't see themselves in it. So there's so many books about global citizenship, 5 characteristics, do this, that. I purposely didn't want to do that, because I do think that to reclaim global, you have to infuse it with personal. And then the challenges of doing that, along with the exhilaration of doing that. And I think you're right about the master class, and I really like this idea. That's exactly why I wanted to do that, because I think for too long we have thought of disciplinary knowledge as somehow divorced from putting ourselves in it. And in the museum world, I used to say that, we were all very used to writing text panels. It's like a voice of God. And one of the things I started doing it, and now other people are doing it too, I said, let's put the name of the curator. Who wrote this? There's a personal side, and it's one point of view. It isn't the point of view. But if you don't personalize who is writing what, then you don't know where they're coming from. What is it that they're trying to do? So deinstitutionalize knowledge to get some person in it.
It's interesting that just last week I went to a book event of Bashir Dian, who's in
Right.
French department and philosophy, and it was a memoir.
I
So
know.
I'm wondering if there's a new trend. You've got me thinking, oh, would I have a memoir right?
No, exactly, because also Mark Mazauer did a memoir about
Yeah,
discourse, he's a historian. And Bashir, I know, just did that. So I think the academic presses are beginning to be interested in this,
yeah.
because there is a way to get knowledge personalized in some ways. Yeah.
And just
Great.
this week, Joyce Flukiger gave a talk about a project she's working on, which is not a memoir, it's ethnographic, but it's from her hometown. It's
Right.
about going back to Missouri, where she grew up, and having this retrospective analysis of her place in the world vis-a-vis her hometown. So
Right.
maybe we're witnessing a trend unfolding before us.
Right. I mean, I
And I'm
think that it doesn't have to be. I mean, one thing that I sometimes worry about is that whole trend that you can't write about something that is different from your own personal background. Also, it's a problem. So it could be your personal reason how you got into this, like Ed Dimick's, piece that was so interesting, that I don't want it to become like South Asia is the purview of only people from the region, because that would be the kiss of death as far as I'm concerned. And you need different people to connect to different parts of the world. So sometimes I'm very sorry that in art history, it just was automatically assumed I would do Indian art. And I wish I had wherewithal to say, no, I want to do Italian Renaissance. Something, why shouldn't, I mean, because that was the other thing, that I had a Japanese colleague who was interested in medieval art, and she was pushed to do Japanese art. Now that we didn't do with the Euro-American friends, because they could study other cultures, but people from other cultures only should study their cultures. And I think that's a problem. Very, very good. Any other comment? Don't be shy. Nice to see you, Uttara. It's great. Well, I think, Quinn, you might have to call on some of your friends from the class, students from the class.
I may, but I see that it's unmuted.
Okay.
Uttara, didn't you have raise your hand?
I just had a comment. I've been following this whole conversation, discussion, talk, whatever you want to call it, all of the above, with great fascination, because it so mirrors my own personal experience and about globalization, about the young people and their pressures and stresses, about all kinds of things, especially about the South Asian global aspect of dance, which is what I'm very involved with. So everything sort of comes together in your talk, Vishakha. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's one of the fun things has been since the book came out, is that lots of people see themselves in it, depending on their perspective. So South Asians have one perspective, young students from other parts of the world have another perspective, then IR specialists have another perspective, art history people have something else to say, and each one of them have different things to say. And so that makes me feel good, because the main purpose of writing this book, even though, a personal story can be one's own and only one's own, but it was written to encompass, it's really a story of many, many millions of people. I'm not alone. It's not unique. I mean, yes, it's unique to me, but lots of people see themselves, so that should be a catalyst for conversations. And that's exactly what's happened. Parents see something else, teachers see something else. So I've actually done a number of programs with K-12, the high school teachers who are doing global stuff. And it's kind of fun, So the goal is to have lots of conversation that people actually think about this in a different way, which is nice. And I'm actually going to do a podcast with the CGT students that will go out. We're going to do it in next week or so. So that will be useful to other students, I hope,
As
And
I
it was
sit
their
here,
idea.
sorry, as I sit here, sort of, messaging some students, reminding them of questions they had during our seminar together, I am compelled to ask you in the meantime. So we have this moment in class where we're talking about the book, we're discussing it, and someone brought up, and I'm going back to what you said about the way that you comport yourself in different contexts, and that you're very reflective, you think about how you're perceived. And you mentioned the sari, you and the sari. So you have this delightful, for those that maybe didn't read the book, you have this lovely chapter in which you describe being in California as a high schooler, is that right? As a high schooler. And you're involved in political protest, you have a leadership role, you really feel like you belong in this cohort, and then you go to Texas. And you're asked by your homestay family to wear, I think, what they might have described as quote unquote ethnic garb, because you wear a sari to church. And you describe how you felt about being kind of, being put in this position. And so in class, we're having this moment, we're talking about the sari and being asked to dress exotic, this exoticization. But then we paused and we remembered another chapter in which you are at the Cleveland Art Museum putting on a demonstration for fifth graders, for children who may have had such a limited scope in terms of, the world. And what do you decide to wear but a sari? And so we bring up this moment, we put these two together about what does the sari mean? And we speculated. They said, well, why is it different? Why does, through the writing, she seems to express some discomfort or a sense that this is put upon her in Texas, and yet it seems to be doing something else in Cleveland with the fifth graders? And we said, a lot of us were saying in speculative terms, I imagine that she might have thought this. I speculate that she thought that. Well, now we have you here. You can just tell us.
I love this question. That is fantastic. So this Vietnam thing in Texas was really a seminal experience in some ways, and that is that when they asked me to wear a sari, I actually thought it's okay. They'd never seen anybody like me, and they were proud that I was there as a weekend guest, and they wanted to show me off, right? But I, by that time, had been in this country for a year, and I was used to at least asking, what is the intent? So the intent of those host family was really benign, They just wanted to let their neighbors know that there was this special person who was their weekend guest. And it's okay. It was more that when the pastor actually started talking about how the last word of Christ was that we had to go where the heathens were, and those heathens were going to go to hell, and then it kind of got my blood to say, oh my God, what am I going to do now? And my poor host family didn't know. They still wanted to introduce me to the guy, And that's when I emphasized, I did namaste, I bowed. I became a very Pakka Indian, even though I had an American accent, precisely to kind of put him in his place. And guess what? It didn't work at all, because the guy didn't know what to do with me. And he just said, oh, what a nice costume you have. And that was the end of that, Whereas by the time I came back to the States as a 21-year-old now, and at the Cleveland Museum, because I knew I was going to do something with dance, because it was in front of the dancing Shiva, the Nataraj, a wonderful sculpture, I was going to do some demonstration and get them involved. It was important that I wore something that I could use in Bharatanatyam. So part of it was to wear a sari rather than a salwar kameez, let's say, because I thought it would be easier for them to see it. And I almost wanted to emphasize that I was from a place that was different from where they came from, and then bring them in. So part of it is agency. I chose to actually emphasize something. I wasn't simply doing it because it was for somebody else's benefit. But I understood that even if it's for somebody else's benefit, that if their intent is benign, why push them? Now, mind you, this was a very different time. Today, we would have all sorts of questions, even for a young person, saying, no, I don't want to be exoticized. I don't want to do this. But I do think that in that process, we forget empathy. And empathy is a crucial question for us to think about belonging in a global sense. that is, put yourself in the other people's shoes. Do they mean well? Do they really mean not bad? And then how do you deal with it? And so, with, for example, Richard Holbrooke, I could tell him later on, he was in a position of power, but I didn't say anything in public to him. I said afterwards to say, I know you mean well, but when you say that, it means this. So don't say that. So at least my attitude in these situations is that, as somebody called me, that I'm an inside subversive. I kind of get in and then I try to push out, rather than banging the door against the wall from the outside and say, you are doing it wrong. And that, I feel like you build more alliances and more people to come in because you are being expansive. And that, I think, is something worth thinking about even in this age of cultural appropriation questions, is ask people what the intent is, and or think about it for yourself and then see what you're going to do. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I'm also thinking too about how you had a relationship with Richard Holbrooke as well, whereas the nature or the depth of the relationship with your homestay family, a relationship for sure, but a different kind. And
yeah, and it's
one
too
that probably
too short a time, and I wasn't going to be there.
Develop trust. Yeah, exactly.
No, it's all contextually relevant, and that's what I like about Ramanujan's thing about how much the truth is contextual. Being is contextual. That's a very Indian thing, right? Yeah.
I know I don't want to ventriloquize our students, but I know that some of these questions came up about knowing when it's appropriate and when you're being kind to others and when you're being kind to yourself to push on certain kinds of things. I know students have talked about the pronunciation of their names, and when people sort of kind of Anglo-Americans can't quite pronounce certain kinds of names, maybe Bengali names or something like this. And when do I just say, yeah, sure, that's basically right? And when am I going to say, no, damn it, that's not the way my name is supposed to be pronounced?
Right. Well, when I first came, and this is more than 50 years ago, actually people often thought nothing of saying, can I call you Vicky? And I said, no. And he said, well, what's your American name? And that's because some of the Chinese people who were here often had an American name. But there were not that many. I mean, this is 1966, and even 1970, there were not that many Indians all around. And I finally figured out the only way to answer that question was to say, gee, do you have an Indian name? And that kind of made them think about, oh, I see. And I said, my name is hard, but it's mainly because there are too many H's in the spelling. So just say it a couple of times and you will get it, and you'll never forget it, because it's so unusual that you won't forget it. And I would remind them that Vishakha is not that common in India too, so it's okay if you can't say it, but just try it. And I didn't make a fuss over the spelling. See, if they dropped one of the H's or added a couple of more H's, that was okay. But just say it, and that's it. And I, to this day, like in the CGT class, I was just saying we have 35 students from 20 different countries and they have different names. I always ask, just pronounce the name for me so that I don't mistake it, rather than just assuming. And I think that's the other thing. Don't assume. If you don't know, ask. And if you can't say it a couple of times. It's okay. But I don't think that you can just let them say, yeah, I'm going to call you. I mean, I used to get Vicky, Varushka, all kinds of names. And I said, no, that's not my name. I do have a name. And there's a wonderful op-ed by the Vietnamese American writer. It says, say my name. And that America is not just Smiths and, all these Western names, but it's also as much about Tan and Lee and all the other names. So that's what America is. It's a really good question, though.
Going off of that, actually, I have another question, if that's
Yes,
okay.
Fiona.
So we talked about this in class as well, relating to the sari and how you can take ownership over how you are perceived by people and when you opt into certain identities and when you choose to opt out. But oftentimes, especially in a place like Columbia's campus, for example, it's how are you what advice would you have to create the kind of space to like engage in conversation where people can actually ask you questions that they might be confused about, where they know that you will extend the grace for them to, make a mistake where you can correct them, but also then draw the line when you don't want to take on that conversational labor of having to explain to someone how to navigate your identities or say your name correctly, because that's not something you always have the energy or
I
the
know.
ability to take on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one actually, because why do I have to always explain myself, right?
Right.
And that's just it's such a pain sometimes. Um, I will say that that's where the generational differences probably come in, because when I first came here, I was so used to doing it that I just do it, because at that point, I mean, most people thought I was Mexican American. So it was just something I did. And I think that as a result, I probably spend more time explaining than not. And I'm very happy now that people don't always ask and say, "Oh, gee, were you born here or did you immigrate?" That's a big change, right? Before it was like it didn't matter where the hell I came from. Um, I I don't have the answer if you don't have the patience right now as to what to do, because that's not what I have done, I would say. Because I was often the only person around who looked like me. So I was just used to doing it. But also, I think by being in the museum field where I was the informant, the cultural informant, the culture, blah, blah, blah. The only thing I would do sometimes is like it happened in Boston when I was in the Museum of Fine Arts. Every time there was anybody who looked South Asian came to the museum, and they would, because there are not that many who came, the information desk people would call me and say, "Oh, maybe you would like to meet this person because Indian person has come in." And I finally had to say, you know what? Actually, that's not a good idea. You don't call every single white person coming in and call American art specialist to say, "Okay, can you meet with them?" And I said, "It's just that I'm busy. I have a lot of work to do, so I can't just go and meet people." And so, but again, it goes back to what Quinn was saying. I'd been there and I was there for a long period of time. So then I could actually cut some of those things short. Um, or sometimes it would happen where in a gathering of Park Avenue blue haired ladies, they would say, "Oh, I went to your country. It is so beautiful and colorful and all of that." And I would say, "Oh, you know what? I actually carry an American passport." And just to let it be like that, don't peg me only one way. And just to try to come up with some way to say, "Yeah, I'm glad you loved India, but actually I carry an American passport." Now, I didn't have to say that, but I felt compelled to say that because I did not want to be begged in a particular way. So try to find ways without being rude to cut the conversation short if you need to. But I think given where we are in this country and even the campus, that we strive to have a more perfect union for America, but we're not there. And the idea is that America is all of us is still not an operative principle. So to some extent, it is what it is, and therefore we have to continue to work on that. All of us, those of us who are in minorities and those who are not. It's a good question, though. All right. Anything else? And we're almost coming to the end. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any other thoughts?
Good to see you, Camilla.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Sorry, I had issues with my video, but I'm here and it was such an interesting discussion and conversation. Thank you so much for enabling us to have more insight about, your life and the way you see India and your multiculturality, and it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
And I'm glad you're taking this South Asian class. I learned that from Quinn. It's great.
Yes, it's interesting.
Terrific.
I'm learning a lot.
Good.
Well, so I guess we'll wrap it up then. I want to thank you so much. Oh, wait. One more question.
Parul.
Hello, Professor Desai. I'm Parul. I just had a comment. This was regarding when you talked about appropriation of certain styles or attitudes while constituting a certain identity or negotiating identities. And I was thinking about South Asian art, particularly art of Lucknow in the 18th century, where the Nawabs were taking in perspectival views, etc., and how uncomfortable it's made a lot of art historians because of that negotiation, and how it carries on even today when you look at putting South Asian art into a certain bracket. And I was wondering what all this globalization or this interface between different cultures, we've not even understood it till now in terms of what to do with it. I just had this comment and I was like wondering what you have to say about this negotiation of identities through artistic practices in the 18th century, which is a time of turmoil and lots of things are happening. And it's all considered as degenerate or...
Right. Yeah, actually, are you an art historian?
Yes, I'm working at the Kunsthistorische Institute in Berlin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow there.
Wonderful, terrific. I think that you're very right that in the canon of Indian art history, that when it comes to 18th century, pretty much everybody thinks of the whole 18th century as kind of a decline, and then Awadh starts and what happens in Lucknow and so forth and so on. I do think that now there are some people who have done a dissertation on Lucknow painting. And I think actually, if you look at it in the context of interculturality, you have to ask yourself why in Lucknow or Awadh, people were interested in doing that more so than in Delhi. What was that? So there was something about the provinciality of that made things possible for them that didn't have the weight of the imperial standing and the workshop. But how is it different from Jahangir, early 17th century painting, where people were also looking to the outside? That's when the perspective things come into Indian pictures then. So why is that privileged, but not Lucknow? And that has something to do with the British presence. So it's really important to ask those questions which people have not asked. And I think that similarly in contemporary art, today, now, those questions are a little bit less pronounced because everybody understands that things are going back and forth in different ways. But when we first started in the mid-90s, I remember, and I quote that in the book, that when we did the tradition extensions, and you should read that because the first essay by the curator, Pinan Poshananda, talks about how the very reality of contemporary art in Asia today is being part of the world and at the same time claiming one's place in the world. And what I actually really understood from that is that when we had the first review, front page of the art section of the New York Times, big spread, and Holland Cotter, who happens now to be a really good friend, but at that point he just started with a quote saying, a friend of mine actually commented that how could there be any good art, contemporary art from Asia or from India? Because if it's there, either it'll be too provincial or too derivative or too little of one or the other. It can't be any good. And then he goes on to disprove that and say how this exhibition actually opens it up. Because for the longest time, that was the primary narrative, that essentially contemporary art in Asia was derivative of the West, as if there's no agency. And so I actually wrote a piece in Art News in, I want to say 1992, 93, I forget now. But it was all to say, what words do we use? When Picasso looks to African art, we say he's inspired by. There's an agency to the artist. When M.F. Hussein looks to Picasso, we say he's influenced by. As if there's no agency. Why? As if artists coming from one place are not making specific selection and a choice compared to the other place. So we have to be careful about the words we use. That artist, that's one thing. And Arthur Danto, the late great philosopher who was at Columbia, one time talked about how artists are going to look at wherever they find inspiration. They're like the weeds in sidewalk, he said, that they're going to find whatever they can and they use it because that's their prerogative. But we don't give that agency because of the issues of power. Similarly, coming back to Lucknow, we don't give the agency to Mir Khan Ghulam. We don't give agency to the Lucknowi artists. Why are they doing that? What are they doing it for? And therefore, we put a value judgment. And those are the questions that we still continue to need to open up in the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Super. What fun. You are muted, Kathy.
Yes, my computer told me that. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you very much for this really multi-layered conversation that brings together the academic and the memoir and politics and art history. And I think it's been an extremely rich experience for all of us. And thank you, Quinn, for stage managing the thoughts of some of the students. I know that Zoom is not conducive for people feeling comfortable to jump in. I mean, even I found that along the way at times. It's like, oh, should I, make that effort to jump? It is something about it. But so thank you very much for both of you and all of you creating, an interactive environment for us to hear Vishakha's thoughts, and I now feel I can call her by her first name in front of all of us, because we all know her, something about her life now.
No, I know oftentimes it's now very weird to meet people and they say, oh, I read your book. I said, okay, then I don't have to say anything. Because my life is the book, so there you go. But I do have to say that I have just absolutely enjoyed this, and for all of you to stay with us. If you have questions, comments, you have my Columbia ID, please feel free to write, and I'm happy to hear from you, because these are big questions and all of you would have something to say or questions you might have. So always happy to continue the conversation. And thank you, Quinn, for really taking the time to guide the students in your class to think through some of the issues that are raised in the book. So I really much appreciate it.
I'll continue to pass the thanks down onto the students for doing the hard work and engaging in an intellectually earnest and with true curiosity. So thanks to them.
And thank you, Kathy, for actually conceiving of this idea. It's a wonderful idea.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess we're wrapping it up.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.